What's the first thing that comes to your mind when you think of the state of Kentucky? Let's face it, a grey-haired colonel in a white suit who gave the world the legendary spicy chicken wings. And for some, even more legendary consequences of eating them the next morning. But there's more to the bluegrass state than that. Kentucky's Louisville is the hometown of another legend, Muhammad Ali. Today there's an international airport named after him. Head south from the airport for about 37 miles and we'll come across a highway interchange. The road here has a telling name, Bullion Boulevard. To our left, there's a fence all along the way, topped with barbed wire, and in the distance, this building comes into view. From above, it looks like this. Trying to get down to ground level, move closer, even closer, no success. And the inside of the building is also a complete mystery to almost everyone. Aside from this fence we drove past, the building is surrounded by 3 more barbed wire barriers. One is electrified, the surrounding area is mined. Armored guard posts with machine gunners stand at the entrance and corners. The walls are over half a meter thick and the blast-proof door weighs 20 tons. No single person knows the full lock code. It requires several officers entering unique combinations simultaneously. Even then, the door won't open immediately, but only after 100 hours. For extra security, military units patrol outside, along with the headquarters of the 100th Training Infantry Division. You can't go touring here, and visitors are strictly forbidden. Even top government officials haven't been seen here in 50 years. Well, at least according to unclassified sources. Many viewers have already guessed, we're not talking about a prison for a movie supervillain, but about Fort Knox. Probably the most heavily guarded place on Earth. But they're not guarding the guards here, of course. It stores what made the dollar the world's currency 80 years ago. The United States gold reserves, with 147 million troy ounces of gold, worth nearly $460 billion, over half of America's total gold. Wait a minute, the dollar hasn't been tied to gold for years, and everyone knows that.
We're dying. We're dying. We need money.
You're right. The gold standard was abandoned 50 years ago, but it wasn't always this way, and the dollar didn't become the world's reserve currency overnight. In this video, let's explore how the dollar climbed to that #1 spot, understand why the gold standard was dropped, if bringing it back is even possible these days, and, most importantly, see for ourselves if there's any truth to claims that what's backing the greenback is just thin air. Don't forget to subscribe and we begin. Now let's move from Kentucky to New Hampshire, home to Mount Washington, the highest peak in the northeastern US. At its foothills sits the Washington Hotel, part of the Bretton-Woods mountain resort. While Allied forces liberated France and Soviet troops were advancing through the Baltics and Belarus, here in Bretton-Woods in July 1944, delegates from all 44 Allied nations gathered to decide how to shape post-war global finance. The chair of the conference was U.S. Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau, but the leading role was taken by his deputy, Harry Dexter White. The British delegation featured none other than John Maynard Keynes, the 20th century's most influential economist, personally leading their efforts. In this episode, we're focusing on representatives from just 2 countries, America and Britain, and for a reason. If you've seen our recent episodes, you already know that was the time for a shift in global power. The conference was a face-off between Keynes and White. The future of the global financial system was at stake, and both men were ready to stand their ground. Besides, other nations simply had bigger problems to deal with at the time. No alternatives were offered. France and the rest of Europe were either rebuilding or still under occupation. Naturally, they cared more about their own recovery than global economics, and Germany, as you might guess, wasn't invited. He had his own special conference in Nuremberg. China wasn't in the picture just yet, and the USSR, although active in post-war reconstruction, didn't bother with international finance. Stalin didn't even care to ratify the final agreements. After all, for 45 years after that, the Soviet Union and the capital West would go their separate ways. In the end, America took the lead at Bretton-Woods, with Britain serving as a challenger. Harry White versus John Maynard Keynes. Who came out on top? Let's start with what they actually agreed on. The Bretton-Woods Conference led to the creation of two major global institutions. First is the International Monetary Fund, or IMF, which provides loans to developing countries and advises them on economic policy. Second is the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, which became the base for the World Bank. True to its name, its focus was on rebuilding post-war Europe, and it must be said it did so successfully. Once there wasn't much left to be reconstructed, the bank shifted its attention from Europe to the Third World. Ever since, it has provided long-term loans for infrastructure and social programs in the poorest countries of Africa and Asia. This organization has faced plenty of criticism, but the one we have on our hands is even more controversial. To understand why the IMF was created and how it differs from the World Bank, we need to go back to the showdown between the Americans and the British at Bretton-Woods. The battle of the century, White versus Keynes. White's scheme looked like this. Every European currency would have a fixed exchange rate against the dollar. The dollar, at the same time, would be locked to gold at $35 per troy ounce. This setup meant no country, not even the US, could recklessly print unbacked money. After all, every currency's value was tied to the dollar, and the dollar was tied to gold. And since gold supply doesn't change too fast, the result was effectively a two-tiered gold standard. Inflation would be kept in check. Currencies could only grow at the same pace as gold was mined. Why the middleman? Couldn't they just tie everything to gold? White's system made sense. Actual physical gold is quite heavy. Transporting it takes time. Storage costs money, and large volume direct use for international trade is honestly impractical. Enter the humble dollar bill. Crisp, lightweight, and perfect for global transactions. These guys would essentially act as gold certificates. Every $35 is 1 troy ounce of gold. 400 times that is a gold bar safely kept away behind 3 rows of barbed wire at Fort Knox. Alright, but why the US dollar? It's like giving them the keys to your finances. Even today, as soon as anyone even mentions an alternative payment system like, I don't know, BRICS, the US response goes nuclear.
He also has repeated his threat of 100% tariffs for BRICS nations if they come up with their own currency to replace the US dollar.
Donald Trump has warned BRICS nations against creating a new reserve currency.
The commander-in-chief has threatened the BRIC nations with 100% tariffs for trying to replace the US dollar as the dominant currency in global trade.
Of course, the idea came from an American, and so the chosen currency ended up being from America. But to be frank, looking at the numbers, he had a good reason for it. This is how gold reserves are distributed worldwide. The largest share is in North America, specifically the US. Today they hold just over 8,000 tons. The runner-up, Germany, isn't even close at around 3,500 tons, not even half as much. But as you might guess, it wasn't always like this. In 1944, the situation was completely different. The US didn't have 8,000 tons of gold. They had 18,500 tons. We've dug up an old 1945 Federal Reserve document showing gold reserves by country. Take a look. It's staggering. While the US shows figures in the tens of thousands of tons, Second place, France and Britain, had barely a couple of thousand, a massive gap. Everyone else's were in hundreds. It also feels strange today to see countries like Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Iran, Persia, or British colonial India listed in an official document. The key reason why the US accumulated so much gold was Europe's fear of war. Foreign governments and major players sought a safe haven, a just in case, which ultimately became reality. This explains why gold inflows grew steadily from 1935, only slowing in 1938. Then Germany annexed Austria on March the 12th. The European capital reacted instantly. Within 2 years, US gold reserves multiplied several times over. In other words, White wasn't just leading Bretton-Woods. He represented the world's main gold depository. How did Keynes respond? Well, you imagine what your response would be if you were the greatest economist of the 20th century. A quick reminder, you can help us make new videos by supporting us on Patreon. The link is in the description. Thank you. In our episode, we discussed that throughout the 19th century, it was the British Empire, not the US, that was the real great power. Its territories and manufactured goods spanned all the seas. The pound sterling was the backbone of international trade. But 2 world wars destroyed the empire's former glory. Though Britain emerged victorious from both conflicts, they also nearly bankrupted it. The last wartime loan from the US was only repaid in 2006. Some of you might have seen it unfold in real time. Perhaps Keynes's vision was to make Britain great again as he went to the conference. He certainly wanted the pound, not the dollar, to regain its status as the world's primary currency, just like in the good old Victorian days. But let's keep in mind that Gary White was a politician first. John Maynard Keynes, on the other hand, was a man of science, a scholar. He wasn't looking to avenge a century of geopolitical catastrophe. He wanted to create a fair, global financial system. Keynes proposed creating a special international currency called the Bancor, which would serve as a universal unit for global transactions. I think I heard that before. Now let's imagine that Russia and China have a common currency, not as a replacement of existing currencies of the BRICS countries, but as an addition to them for international trade settlements between the participating countries, but implementing a supranational unit of account for inter-country transactions.
Это может быть какая-то наднациональная, условно, расчетная единица.
To make that work, Keynes proposed creating an international clearing union, essentially a unified exchange where all countries would conduct foreign trade deals using these Bancors. These Bancors were meant to become the new old gold, a universal anchor for all currencies, and coincidentally the name sounds similar to the French or bancaire, meaning banking gold. But in a conference between politicians, Keynes's scholarly authority didn't matter as much. The political influence of the United States outweighed his academic prestige. Bancor continued to exist only on paper, while the dollar grew to be more than just paper. And instead of an international clearing union, we got the IMF. But what's it good for? Remember the trade balance, the thing over which Trump threatens to do tariffs? Put simply, it's a country's net foreign trade position. If a country exports more than it imports, dollar earnings will flow in, boosting its reserves. But if a country imports a lot with little export, it must either attract foreign capital or expend its reserves. In modern economies, this imbalance is corrected through exchange rates. In the first scenario, the national currency strengthens. In the second, it weakens. Imagine the dollar suddenly begins to exchange at 200 units of an imagined currency. This country's goods become cheaper abroad while imports grow more expensive. Result: imports drop, exports rise, and the balance adjusts itself. Vice versa, if the currency appreciates and the dollar drops to just 50 units, cheap imports flood in. Exports become pricier and less competitive and decline. This makes exchange rates act as an automatic stabilizer for trade balances. But fixed rates mean you can't also fix trade balances along with them. Let's say there's an agreement to peg the dollar to gold at $35 per ounce. Let's even assume all other currencies convert through the dollar. You still can't freeze the volume of trade between nations. Forget WTO, you'd need to create a whole union of intercontinental socialist republics. This exact contradiction led to the creation of the IMF, a need for an international reserve pool. When a country faced a trade deficit, it could ask an IMF for a loan to correct it. Countries with surpluses held larger quotas, meaning they contributed more to the fund. Put it simply, it functioned like a regular bank. Those with savings kept deposits, while those short on funds took loans. The actual procedures were a bit more complex, but we can skip the details. So the country buys a lot from abroad, sells little and in a constant trade deficit, then asks for new loans every year? What happens then? In our daily lives, that someone would soon be declared bankrupt, but you can't allow this on a national level. That's when the exchange rate mechanism comes into play. The IMF carefully analyzes macroeconomic indicators and approves a devaluation of the national currency. Or if a country has a persistent trade surplus and excessive reserves year after year, it can ask for help to revalue its currency by making it stronger. This was effectively a trade-off. Countries surrendered part of their monetary sovereignty in return for a promise that if their economy wasn't doing too good, the IMF would leap to financially rescue them like a superhero. This international monetary supervisor was born out of Bretton-Woods system. It functioned like a global bank with authority to manage national currency exchange rates. But the entire scheme had one unchangeable rate. Remember which one? $35 per troy ounce of gold. This was both the foundation of the entire Bretton Woods architecture and the time bomb that eventually destroyed it. On February 4th, 1965, French President Charles de Gaulle sent the military cruiser Colbert to US shores, packed to the brim with dollars. He demanded they open Fort Knox's 20-ton vault door to exchange green paper for shiny yellow metal. "Here's your funny money," General de Gaulle supposedly scoffed at President Lyndon B. Johnson. This anecdote sounds more like a lover's quarrel than an actual piece of diplomacy, and although the story has been retold for decades as political folklore, it's probably fake. What actually happened, as described by former French President Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, was much less dramatic. I can tell you another anecdote about this. General de Gaulle announced during this famous press conference that France would convert its surplus dollars into gold. Every month we repatriated a few tons according to the safety rules in this field. The general, questioning me, found that all this was going much too slowly, and he suggested that I send the cruiser Colbert to New York, load our gold by claiming it from the Americans. You can imagine the effect produced by the arrival of this warship. Fortunately, we were able not to follow up. Yeah, in the 60s, France, just like other European countries, actively exchanged dollars for gold. And the US, true to its word, dutifully shipped out gold bars at the fixed rate of $35 per troy ounce. The Bretton-Woods system was running like a Swiss precision watch. But as you know from our crisis videos, you can't keep withdrawing something forever. Take a look at these two charts. First, this one. This is the monetary base. In simple terms, how many dollars have been printed. The line goes up. Now look here. This is the value of US gold reserves. It's trending down. By the late 1950s, there were already $50 billion in circulation. but the US only had enough gold to cover $20 billion, and the gap kept getting wider. On one hand, global GDP was booming. International trade was expanding alongside the demand for dollars as the world's reserve currency. On the other hand, the US kept giving out dollars for gold at $35 an ounce, bleeding its reserves dry. Fort Knox's shelves were emptying, while the Fed's printing press was picking up pace. Economic law states that if a commodity, gold in this case, gets more scarce while demand increases, that commodity must rise in value. But gold's price was fixed, same $35, like a fundamental constant, the speed of light, you know. They should have included it in the International System of Units and Bureau of Weights and Measures. This contradiction made European countries realize that the gold for exports arrangement was going to run dry soon. It was logical to buy it cheap while they still could. The Americans were aware of this too, but they had their hands tied, and they were the ones who signed the agreement. The Bretton-Woods system might have made the dollar the world's primary currency, but it also became a black hole swallowing America's gold reserves. By that point, Keynes was long dead, but seeing American officials sweat bullets as they tried to find a solution would probably have made him chuckle. By 1971, the situation had reached a critical point and was spiraling out of control. On August 2, President Richard Nixon summoned Treasury Secretary John Connally and White House Chief of Staff H.R. Haldeman to discuss what to do about it. Haldeman reported that in just the past few weeks alone, the French had withdrawn over $1 billion worth of gold from the US reserves. Germany and the Netherlands were about to follow suit, demanding another 25 million ounces. Connally estimated America's gold losses could reach $3 billion by year's end. What would you have done in their position? Here's what Connally said. "We can stop convertibility very easily by just saying so. The next thing is that you probably ought to float this exchange rate with the other currencies of the world." In other words, Nixon had to sever the dollar's link to gold. No more $35 per ounce. Let the market decide what Fort Knox's gold bars were really worth. This was August 2nd, 1971. Here's the kicker. Just 2 weeks earlier, on July the 19th, British officials reached the same conclusion. John Sangster, an expert at the Bank of England, drafted a classified memo titled "Some Possible Consequences of the Americans Formally Going Off Gold." The UK was sitting on $4 billion in dollar reserves and wanted to keep their worth. They realized that the $35 per ounce deal was gone. In fact, it's cashing in their entire stash that could deliver the death blow to Bretton-Woods. Then on July 26th came another memo, this time top secret. Its opening line was a warning. If America abandoned, it would open Pandora's box, threatening global trade and integration in an unprecedented way. Finally, on August the 10th, a third top-secret memo appeared in which the British pretty much resigned themselves. The gold standard collapse is inevitable. Time to think of ways to salvage what's in reserves. They outline 4 options. 1. Demand a full conversion of all dollars into gold as stipulated by Bretton-Woods. 2. Reduce dollar reserves by settling IMF obligations. 3. Obtain a loan from the US to offset part of the reserves. 4. Invest dollars in bonds. The memo quickly notes the first option would likely provoke the US to drop the standard outright. The second option is just too slow, leaving only the last 2 alternatives as viable. No one knows how the decision was made, and so just 2 days later, on August the 12th, Britain's ambassador to the US, Roland Stanley Baring, the Earl of Cromer, marched into the US Treasury and formally demanded, on behalf of Her Majesty's Treasury and the Bank of England, the conversion of $3 billion into gold. It's difficult to say why the British chose the first out of all the options, but as predicted, this became the final bullet that killed the bullion. Nixon immediately called up his cabinet to Camp David and spent the entire weekend coming up with a plan. Sunday evening, August the 15th of 1971, American families turned on their TV expecting another episode of Gunsmoke, but were met with President Nixon's address.
I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets, except in amounts and conditions determined to be in the interest of monetary stability and in the best interest of the United States.
This speech was, in a way, a form of default. The US had refused to further honor the obligation of dollar-gold fixed convertibility. Bretton-Woods and the gold standard were no more. Nothing was backing up the dollar anymore. The argument you'll hear most often about the US actions sounds something like this. They just wanted to print unlimited dollars and the gold standard stood in their way, so they got rid of it. There's some truth to this. From a monetary policy point of view, they became free. Besides, since they abandoned the standard in 1971, gold has appreciated by 2 orders of magnitude, 100 times growth. A $35 per ounce peg today would mean a 99% drop in the value of the dollar. Just imagine if America had honored its commitment, limiting money supply to match gold reserves. What then? Regular viewers will recall our discussions of the Great Depression. It was caused by an extreme shortage of circulating money for a then bustling economy. A similar crisis could have happened to the entire global economy. The gold standard's supply couldn't have expanded fast enough for the whole world. The world was running on dollars. Dollars were running on gold. If you can only print new dollars when you dig up new gold, you're going to run the economy into the ground. The expansion of gold mining had to match the expansion of global trade. This is why returning today to a gold standard or something similar is a terrible idea. What's in our nature is to create, to run, to expand, to develop and invent all the time, not constricting ourselves. If a currency depends on a resource, gold, oil, electricity, anything tangible, the whole economy starts depending on it. The dollar isn't broken just because it hasn't been backed by gold since 1971. Sure, you can no longer exchange it for gold at a fixed rate, but that's no longer necessary. Both gold and dollars, just as all other currencies, are now traded commodities. Their price is set by supply, demand, and, par for the course, speculation. The same animal spirits drive markets. They just wear suits now. The dollar may not be backed by anything, but steady demand for it persisted for nearly a century. Who knows, maybe a stable currency doesn't actually require vaults of gold bars locked behind barbed wire. In our previous episode, we talked about how modern global trade as we know it began with the Bretton-Woods Conference, when the US took Britain's place as the dominant economic power. Its rise wasn't without hurdles. We'll explore them along with the IMF's role in shaping the system in future episodes. Share this video with your friends. For more than 6 years, we've been making our best effort to produce the best content for you, and we'd be happy to have an even larger audience. And I'm the researcher.